Hello, these are flipped notes 2-2, and it's all about communication in the nervous system. So my Bitmoji's got her cell phone because we're talking all about how the brain uses neurons to communicate with the rest of the body. Let's get to it. So we've learned already that your body has 86 billion neurons. That's a lot of neurons. Not 100, we know that was a myth, but 86 billion. So what is a neuron? Really breaking it down here. Neurons are individual cells. So you've learned about cells in biology classes, other science classes. Things that have got a nucleus and they've got mitochondria and the cell wall, cytoplasm, all that stuff. That's a neuron also. But a neuron is a little bit different because it's specialized to be in the nervous system. They have an ability to receive messages, they integrate them, which means they process them, and they decide if they're going to continue relaying a message or if they're going to stop, if they're basically if they're going to inhibit or excite, and then they transmit information onto other neurons. We say that neurons have an electrochemical message because they're going to have a neural impulse, which is what you see in the pictures here, these little flashes of light. That's a neural impulse. But then they also release chemicals from one neuron to the other, and those come in the form of neurotransmitters. So neurons have an electrochemical message. All right, so let's look at the makeup or the body of the neuron. Let's see, let's move me over here. So first of all, we've got our cell body over here. The cell body is also called the soma. There's actually several names that are interchangeable here, and those will be on another slide. But the cell body, we don't go into a whole lot of details about what's going on in there, other than that you just need to know that the nucleus is in there. It's the cell's life support center. This is where action potentials or neural impulses, they're the same thing, are generated. So there's definitely magic happening there inside the cell body. Extending from the cell body is a part of the neuron that's unique from other types of cells, and these are called dendrites. The dendrites in the crash course video were called the listeners of the cell, but they reach out like little tree branches, and they sometimes they're actually called dendritic trees or dendritic branches, and they act as antenna, and they're receiving messages from other cells. So other neurons are releasing neurotransmitters, and they're going to bind onto the ends of these dendrites. Another part of the neuron that is unique to this type of nerve cell is the axon. And the axon is this long, thin, hair-like extension that extends out from the cell body. You may recall from the crash course that they said some of your axons are as long as your leg. So they can be very short or very long. Um, then wrapping around our axon passes the message away. So we've got a message being generated here in the cell body, and it's indicated here by this brown arrow. And that's our, let's see, does it say it on here somewhere? But that's our, oh yeah, our neural impulse, the electrical signal traveling down the axon. Our axon is wrapped in a fatty tissue called myelin sheath. And myelin sheath actually continues to thicken or grow as we get older. And that's why some of our thinking and mental processing gets better as we age, because we continue to have more myelin sheath develop, which helps to speed the neural transmission. Different disorders can affect myelin sheath, but the most prominent one is multiple sclerosis. Actually eats away and deteriorates the myelin sheath. And the way that I usually remember that is that MS, multiple sclerosis, is the same initials as myelin sheath. So it looks kind of like sausage casings here. That's what I always picture it looks like, but that myelin sheath is wrapped around the axon. And then we get to the end of the axon down here, and we have some more branches that are kind of similar to what we had on the other end. These are called the terminal branches of an axon. Terminal means the end, so it's the end of the neuron. And right, each one of these has a little area at the end. Sometimes they're called the terminal bud, and we'll zoom in on those here in just a minute. But this is where there are chemicals that are waiting to be released. So neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals, are hanging out in there. And when that action potential gets to the end of the neuron, it's going to release or tell it to just kind of hold off for a little bit. But the action potential will carry a message that tells those neurotransmitters what to do next. So here we've got a little bit of a summary in words other than just what I was saying. Our soma or cell body is what contains the nucleus. The dendrites, those were the branching structures that receive signals from other cells. They're like the antenna. The axon is that long, thin fiber that carries signals away from the soma to the other cells. The myelin sheath is our fatty substance that insulates and encases the axon. And then our terminal buttons, terminal branches, different names, those are the small knobs at the end of the axon that releases the neurotransmitters to the synapses. Let's talk about the synapse. Neurons do not touch each other. So we've got 86 billion neurons and they don't touch each other. In the crash course, Hank Green said they're playing like the world's biggest game of I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you. So in between neurons, we call this space the synapse. The synapse is the gap in between neurons. So if they can't touch, how do they relay that message? So a neuron has that action potential, neural impulse, they're the same thing. It's going to travel to the end of the neuron, but the action potential cannot cross the synaptic gap. So instead, it forces neurotransmitters out of the neuron, and neurotransmitters are these little bitty chemicals that float across the gap, and they bind to the next neuron, the receiving neuron. The receiving neuron has receptor sites, and it doesn't look like it in this image, but this is actually the dendrites of the next neuron. So those neurotransmitters float across there, they bind, they deliver their message, and then they actually go back across the synapse to where they came from. So we have two neurons here. We have the sending neuron that had the original action potential, and they're sending neurotransmitters across the synapse. And then we have a receiving neuron that's receiving the neurotransmitters, but then will eventually return them. So I mentioned that several of those names are used interchangeably, so I'll try to lay it out here to make it a little bit more clear. So the action potential is also called the neural impulse. In class, I like to call it the whoosh, because when we watch one of our video clips, when they show the action potential traveling down the axon, it makes a whoosh sound. Sometimes I also refer to them as pew, pew, because that's how I imagine like a neuron firing is real fast, kind of like that. So any of those, but on the AP exam, don't call it the whoosh, call it the action potential or the neural impulse. The synaptic terminal, the axon terminal, those are also called the terminal button, the terminal branches, the terminal buds. So you can see that they all have in common terminal, which means the end. The synapse is sometimes called the synaptic gap or the synaptic cleft. So both indicating that space in between the neurons. And the soma, also called the cell body. We talked about with the somatic nervous system that soma means body. So same thing, the cell body, but just enough to confuse you, but just make sure you know them all. All right, so let's talk more about that neural impulse, the action potential. So while a neuron is just waiting to receive a message, we say that it has a resting potential. It is stable, it has a negative charge. Now, I don't go into all the deep detail about sodium ions and sodium channels, but there is a lot more detail to what causes that neural impulse to form. But for this level of psych, we're not going to worry about that. So, but while the neuron is waiting to receive a message, it's at its resting potential. When it receives a message from a sending neuron, it causes a voltage spike in the nucleus, and that creates an action potential that's going to travel along the axon. And it's going to fire. So the neuron fires. When we say the neuron's firing, it is having an action potential. But after a neuron fires, it's totally wiped out. It cannot fire again until it has had a chance to kind of gain its strength. Now, in real time, that's not that long. But in neuron time, it has to wait a short time. And that short waiting period is called the absolute refractory period. So a brief time after action potential before another action potential can begin. So it's like it was whoosh, and then it's tired. And then it has to wait to gather its strength again before it can fire again. The other thing that we say about neural impulses is that they follow the all or none law, which means a neuron fires at full strength or it doesn't fire at all. It doesn't have a slow whoosh. Like it doesn't have a slow, tired whoosh. It's just whoosh, whoosh. There's full strength neural impulses. That's why it has to wait. So neurons can't fire slower. Sometimes people will say that the neurons fire slower, like alcohol causes the brain to fire slower, but that's kind of incorrect wording. Instead, that neuron fires less often, and that's what's going on with alcohol use. So instead of a slower whoosh, it's a less frequent whoosh. All right, so taking a more zoomed in look at what's going on at the end of the neuron in the axon terminal. So here we've got our sending neuron, it's sending that action potential, and down here in the yellow, we've got our terminal branches. So here is just the very end of one of those branches. And here's our action potential that's coming down the axon. Inside there are little vesicles. And the vesicles are sort of these little bubbles. And within each vesicle are chemicals, the neurotransmitters. And in our next section, we'll talk about what each of those neurotransmitters are. But they're things like serotonin and dopamine and endorphins. That's what's hanging out in there. So as that action potential comes down comes down the axon, it forces these vesicles to the very end of the terminal. And then once they get there, it causes the axon terminal or the terminal bud to open up, and it releases neurotransmitters across the synaptic gap. And they bind at receptor sites on the very next neuron. So then dopamine, serotonin, they're delivering a message. And each one of those can be excitatory or inhibitory, telling the next neuron to fire again or to pause. We're done firing. We'll talk about those later. After the neurotransmitter delivers its message, the receiving neuron, the next neuron, lets it go and it goes back. So usually it goes back. When it goes back to where it came from, that is called reuptake, and that's shown over here. So normally the previous neuron, the sending neuron, will pull those neurotransmitters back in and they'll be repackaged again into the vesicles. So they're kind of recycled and they can be used again. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes some of those neurotransmitters dissolve in the gap and it's kind of like they floated away and disappeared. It just depends what it is and what's going on, but they are highly complex, but we try to simplify neurotransmitters for this class. So again, the neurotransmitters are in vesicles, and that's where they're created. Synthesis happens there in the vesicles. They are pushed to the end of the axon terminal. They're released. They deliver their message. They come back through reuptake. And I think that might be the end of it. Yep. So our next one will be all about the neurotransmitters. And that is it for this one, Flipped Notes 2-2.